care is not a big enough word. I wrote a letter to my boys. I told my boys that I love them more than anything on this earth. And I'm so, so sorry that it ended like it did. I prayed and prayed and I pled to God, please, please let me get out of this.
When desire overtakes reason, the human mind can unleash deadly obsession. These are true stories told by the victims.
I was 44 years old when I divorced, and I'm like, you're almost halfway there. You better start doing some good, positive things. And so in August of 2012, I had just started my job with Texarkana Independent School District. I'm a teacher. I was really looking forward to this new chapter in my life. I had a Cinderella upbringing. Both of my parents worked in education. I was born into a Christian home. My parents were very strict, but they were strict in a good, loving way. God loves us, we love others. That was a very strong theme all throughout my upbringing. I got my bachelor's degree in elementary education and started teaching school right after that. First day after I taught, I remember thinking, I cannot believe I'm getting paid for this. I would do this for free. I got married in between my junior and senior year of college in 1989. We met on a summer job, so I was 20 when I met him and 21 when we married. My husband and I were married for 6 years before we had our first son. Lincoln was born in 1996. I had a second child 2.5 years later. His name is Hudson. I think what happened to us happens to a lot of families. You kind of lose touch with each other. We got married really young. I poured my life into raising my boys, and my husband was at work a lot. There was not a lot of time for relationship building. I eventually found a house that I loved. So it was a house that was built in the 40s with still that original wood floors. It was 3 bedrooms. I spent a lot of time decorating it and working on it and just building my nest. Even painted the doors a bright yellow color because I felt like that was a happy yellow. This house had an attic. I had some people come over and see if we could convert the attic into an actual second floor.
I want to turn it into a recording studio for my boys. I need to keep their drum set away from me.
We'll double the soundproof.
The person that picked up, his name was Curtis Jones. He came over and looked at the space. My first impression of Curtis was that he was confident. He was confident in the job.
I'd only need two of my team on the job, so that'll keep the price down.
Had kind of a charisma about him, but he's not attractive at all. Is that rude? I don't know how to say that. He just seemed like the best person for the job, and that's all it was supposed to be.
Oh, hey, come on in.
Just making sure my team are on track. 2 more weeks and we're done. Just holler if you need any other help with anything.
I'm okay. You go check on your team, huh?
Kind of got a whiff of like, maybe he's like liking me. he kept coming over and kept coming over and kept talking to me. I mean, he knew that I had just gotten divorced, and I said, I am not at all looking for any kind of a relationship, friendly or otherwise. I'm working on this house, raising my boys, and getting my life back together. He didn't take the hint, and he didn't take no for an answer, and he just kept coming.
One more day and we're done.
Curtis did pay attention to me. That felt good. I'd been in this dry desert of a marriage for many, many years, and then little sprinkles of rain. I felt really good.
So I was thinking maybe I could take you out sometime.
Well, I was wondering how long it would take for you to ask.
I consciously thought, I'm just going to have fun for a little bit. That is how our relationship began. In the spring and summer of 2013, I did just fall into a routine. There was never a conversation. There was never like, you know, do you want to be my boyfriend or girlfriend or anything like that. I fell into a routine of him always calling me and being there. I knew we weren't the same. We weren't equally yoked. I knew that he had some history of some mistakes.
Why didn't you tell me about this sooner?
There's no good time to say you have a criminal record.
We've been together for months.
I'm sorry. It's not as bad as it sounds. 10 years ago, I split from my ex. I went back into her house to get my stuff. She called the cops, and I was charged with burglary. I went to jail.
It wasn't 10 days or 10 weeks or even 10 months. It was 10 years ago. He had stayed out of trouble and been a productive, member of society for a decade. We did go on motorcycle rides in Arkansas up in the windy mountains, or we would go to dinner, just do normal stuff, watch movies or, hang out. I don't like cigarettes and smoking, so he quit smoking for about 3 months, which I appreciated. And then he slowly started smoking again, and I was like, what? You've gone this long, and I know that was hard, so why are you starting up? He wanted to be around me a lot. It wasn't very, thoughtful. Maybe he was on his best behavior at the beginning, and then slowly that wore off. One night, I remember we just pulled into a gas station and we're getting gas.
Give me a candy bar.
And he just barked orders at me. I would have done anything for him if he'd asked nicely, but the way he barked it at me like I was a maid or a dog.
Get your own.
I was just like, you don't bark orders at me like that.
What the hell did you just say to me? What do you say to me? Get your own. You get me a candy bar. If I ask you to get me a candy bar, you get me a candy bar.
That was one of the first times that I kind of felt scared.
You get out there and get me a candy bar right now.
It embarrassed and humiliated me. And I jumped out of the truck
Get me a candy
and
bar.
made the decision to walk home. I made a quick right turn into a dark neighborhood that probably wasn't very safe. I heard a truck turn onto the street. I could just tell by how it was driving that it was him.
Get in the truck.
I remember hearing his truck screech around the corner. I could just tell that it was him.
Get in the truck.
My heart was beating hard. I was breathing hard. I was angry. He just grabbed me like this to pull me into the truck. It seemed like it was in the blink of an eye. We were in the truck and it was over. He proceeded to drive me home, yelling the whole way. There was a mixture of emotions. There was shock, there was fear, there was anger that he would treat me in such a way, and there was embarrassment and humiliation. I was scared, but as this was the first time that he had really shown any physical aggression or, a dangerous side. It was a fight, it was over, and I didn't give it the weight that I should have. I should have cut ties right then. He had a special knack for turning things around and making it seem like it was your fault. I did not tell my parents. I did not tell any other friends. I did not tell the police.
Want some juice, Angel?
The next morning, just acts like nothing's wrong. And that's not okay with me. I have to talk things out and have an apology.
I'm sorry. I just couldn't stand you running off like that.
I definitely thought after this incident that it was a one-time thing, that it would never happen again. A few weeks later, he got angry for something. All I remember is that I refused to do what he asked me to do. And he grabbed me by the hair and grabbed me by the neck and the back and drug me across the room. So literally his hand is back here and he's dragging me and my feet are trying to keep up. And he throws me on the couch. I've never been touched in such a manner. It's confusing because this person that's supposed to love you can treat you in such a horrific manner. For somebody to drag a whole body across the room by their hair, it was horrifying. I am a mom, I'm a teacher, I'm a Christian, I'm a sister, I'm a friend. If a girlfriend of mine had come to me and told me what was going on, I would have said, get away from him, you deserve more. But when I was in it, I couldn't see it. But this hair pulling incident changed my mind.
You need to leave.
That was the first time that I did pay attention to a red flag. I need a clean break, and this is just not healthy for me. I thought that I could break up with him. I could go back to my regular life, and he could go back to his, and that would be the end of it. It's embarrassing to not be the strong woman that you were brought up to be. And it's embarrassing because some people told me, he's not a good influence. You shouldn't be around him. And I didn't listen. And so my humiliation and embarrassment about that kept me in isolation. And that was a huge mistake. He used his conniving skills of saying, well, I love you so much. I've never had anything like this before, and I need to still, be friends with you. And if you aren't friends with me, or you do just cut me off suddenly, then I'll go crazy. He would leave messages and say, I'm the one that's been, your protector or keeping you safe, and I'm just checking on you. So if you'll just let me know that you're okay, then, I'll leave you alone. If I didn't answer, he would come by. That was the beginning of an obsession of him trying to get back with me. I was not changing my mind. I was not going back. And I think that once he realized, that made him angry. And that's where he turned a corner and things got super scary. Just constantly having the feeling that somebody's watching you and somebody's following you is nerve-wracking. It literally exhausts you emotionally to constantly be looking over your shoulder. I went to the bank and was changing all of my banking accounts and everything because he had stolen papers and files from my house. I heard my car lock, the lights going on and off. I knew it was him because he was the only one that had a set of keys. I'm on high alert all the time. And so, yes, when I left the bank, I was looking over my shoulder and looking left and right and trying to see him and trying to stay safe. He just tormented me every day for no reason.
Hello?
You need to listen.
He started telling me that he had friends. They owed him some favors. He was threatening me with a motorcycle gang.
Why are you saying all this?
He talked to them and told them I knew some bad stuff about him and that I was going to go to the police and tell on him, and that his biggest fear was to go back to prison. If he can't get me back, then he or someone else will take care of me. It might be 6 weeks from now, it might be 6 months from now. And if I ever end up going away or going to jail or something, they're gonna get you. And even if I'm not here, you can know that it was from me. Lincoln, he was at college, so he was in Tennessee for part of this time. My son Hudson was staying with his dad more than he was me, which was so hard because I want my child with me. But I was afraid that my house was dangerous. I was still keeping up a facade at work that everything was okay. I didn't tell anyone because I was embarrassed. He told me one time that this motorcycle gang put explosives on the bottom of my car. He had talked to them, so they were going to come take them off that night. So if I heard something outside my house or going on with my car, not to be alarmed. Once again, he was doing me a favor. I was exhausted. You can't make good judgments. I couldn't differentiate what was ridiculous lies. Every little bitty noise, you think, that's probably them. I prayed a whole lot. I got in my car and he called me, and I was terrified still and wanted to know, were they off? Did they do what they were supposed to do, you know? And he says that they did. You're fine. You're safe. You know, thank goodness you have me. I never know what to believe, but the fear of that possibly being true is what keeps me stuck and paralyzed. I remember thinking, what if he just told me they took them off? What if they're still on there? I was terrified to turn the key. He said there were explosives on my car. Men were coming over to take them off. I was terrified still and wanted to know, were they off? He says that they did. You're fine. You're safe. What if they're still on there? If I die, I know where I'm going. I was terrified to turn the key. And I did. Nothing happened. And I said more prayers of thankfulness. That was another layer of hatred to put me through, torment and fear. One time I remember I got home and I opened my back gate. There was a huge piece of broken sheetrock blocking the whole entire staircase. There was a letter taped to the door. There were dying flowers in a vase by the door. These were the thoughts of a desperate, irrational human. Desperate people do desperate things, and so that's what was scary to me. It was disturbing. It continued and escalated. He was relentless. He would not let go. One day when I got home, he had ladders and ropes and paint cans and probably 4 or 5 men and work trucks all in and around my yard, and they were frantically painting the whole entire outside of my house. I said, Curtis, I did not ask you to paint my house, and I have asked you to stay away. And I remember saying, you are dangerous to me, and I cannot be with someone that is dangerous to me. I made the mistake of cracking my door 1/2 inch. He barged his shoulder in with all of his might.
Your friends think we've broken up? Take out your phone.
He tells me, you're going to text them right now and tell them that you made a mistake and that really I'm a good guy and that we're back together. He kept shoving the gun in my head and was saying, do it, do it. texted them, I've made a mistake. Curtis really is a good guy, just exactly what he told me to. We are still, in a relationship. And I pressed send. And he left. And I just shook like a leaf for the rest of the night. There are no words to describe. Terror is not a big enough word. At one point, he called and said, "Do you want all this to end?" I was willing to hear any ideas and have this be over. I was emotionally exhausted. And he said, "If you pay me $5,000, I will leave you alone forever." So I said, "I don't have $5,000. And he said, "I've seen your credit and I know that you can get $5,000 if you want it." He said, "If you do that, I won't kill you." I begged and pleaded with him to just stop, and there was some other way. And he said, "This is the only way." My thought process was, is $5,000 worth my boys not going to my funeral? And I answered yes. I thought, maybe today's the last day.
This is really the end, right?
Maybe this nightmare is over tonight. He said, "If you don't want to die, you'll let go." He took all the money I had. I really had hope that it was the end. I wanted it to end so badly. I went to my sister's for Christmas with my kids, and so I was excited, but I was petrified and nervous keeping these two worlds apart. And I remember one time my mom and sister in the kitchen just talking about a recipe. And I remember watching them, and it was like, how can y'all be talking about a recipe? Like, I'm trying to stay alive over here. Like, it just seemed so mundane. I wish I had that. I wish I was talking about a recipe instead of talking about not getting killed. I had a security system in my home. I could check from my phone. I had cameras so you could see all the way through my house. I could turn the alarm on remotely from my phone. Curtis was in my house. I had a security system in my house. I could check from my phone. I had cameras so you could see all the way through my house. Curtis was in my house. I would turn the alarm on the house remotely from my phone. He would be inside the house and turn the alarm off.
Hello?
Curtis called and I told him to get out of my house. He wouldn't do it.
You're at your sister's.
Just leave us alone, please.
I, on purpose, never told him where my sister lived. He said that he and a bunch of people were already on the way. And he spit out her address. I had to leave. I made up some lame story that they all knew wasn't true. I got in my car and I left as fast as I could. And I was trying to draw him away from my boys and my parents and my sister and her kids. I don't want my kids to see me murdered. I don't want to be the cause of this tragedy in all these people's lives. I would just rather go and be murdered by myself than have them see that. So. And it was super, super hard to leave. I kept driving until I found some little fishing cabins. That is the night that I knew I was probably going to die. My ex-husband bought me a .22 pistol. I had a Bible and a gun to protect my own life. I wrote a letter to my boys. And I told them the truth about what was going on. And I told my boys that I love them more than anything on this earth. And I'm so, so sorry that it ended like it did. I made a decision that I had to ask for help. I had to tell my parents what was going on. And I had to tell the police what was going on. So I ran and I called my dad and I said, I'm in trouble and I need help. And I told him everything that had been going on. That Curtis told me that he was coming to get me. So I told him that I was going to the police, and that's what I did. Amy Smith, who was at the Domestic Violence Center, said, we will help you and we will walk you through every single step. I was getting an emergency protective order because my life was really in danger. That was the first person that reached out their hand to me and helped me, and I thought, maybe she can help me and I won't die. My parents came into town to be with me and to help me. I've been trying to protect my family from being involved, and I felt very guilty. Now they had to experience some terror with me. About 1:30 at night, my dad came into the bedroom and he said, somebody just threw a brick through the window. I jumped up and I ran in there, and my mother was terrified. A brick had come through 2 panes of a storm glass window, had hit the wooden headboard so hard that it broke the headboard, and wood chips were all the way across on the other side of the bedroom. Had that headboard not been there and stopped the brick from coming all the way through, it would have hit my mom in the head and severely damaged, if not killed her.
I want to press charges.
They explained to me that I didn't have any proof that it was him that threw the brick.
I have a protection order. There must be something we can do.
We could come up with a burglary charge because I had proof from the alarm company's website that I was turning on an alarm from a remote area with my phone, and he was turning it off from inside the house. He was picked up and arrested for burglary. The detective told me he's going to be mad when he gets out. So you need to take precautions and you need to be very careful. I left church and I got home. I pulled up into my garage. I had a habit of shutting my garage door completely before I would get out of the car. I was just about to shut the garage door. My first thought was, get your gun, get your gun. And I thought by the time I turned to get my gun and turned back towards him, it'll be too late. So I threw my car in reverse and backed down the driveway as fast as I could. And as I was putting it in drive to go forward, I could not believe that he was actually shooting at me. The glass shattered all in my face, and it was so loud. It was so loud. He opened fired for what seemed like forever. I felt like it was maybe 6 shots, but the police later found 4 casings. I drove a little ways. I parked somewhere. I didn't feel any pain. You're so terrified and your whole body's so numb. I knew I saw blood here and I knew that I had been shot. I called and she said, 911, how can I help you? And out of my mouth came, I've been shot, I've been shot. And so I told her what street I was on. I said, where are they? And she said, they're coming, hold on. It seemed like forever to me. I'm sure it was a few seconds, maybe a minute. I just felt like that if I stopped thinking or stopped moving, then I would die. So you don't have a choice. You just are in survival mode. And I felt like God gave me a clear mind. A policeman got there and opened the door and put his hands on my bullet wound and put pressure there, assured me that help was coming. I remember turning around and looking and seeing police scrambling, hearing radios, and them calling out a description of Curtis and a description of his truck. They were looking for him, but they didn't know where he was. I ended up at the hospital, and there were guards around my room because he was a shooter on the loose. So that very first night in the hospital, they didn't want me to be left alone, and I didn't want to be left alone. The next day, they were contacting people that he knew. It was on Friday morning that somebody convinced him to go talk to the police. He went to the police station and said, I understand that y'all are looking for me. and they found the gun hidden in between some rocks in this creek in my neighborhood that I didn't even know existed. We had the gun and we had shells from the site, and so we had possibility for some ballistics and some hard evidence that he was the one that pulled the trigger. I found out that that bullet broke my pelvic bone, traveled through and tunneled through my pelvic bone, and is still sitting in my back today. I choose to look at that bullet like a good thing because to me, that's a constant reminder every day to be grateful for every minute and every hour and every day. Some decisions that I made got me in the predicament in the first place, and those are the things that I'm sorry for. My boys were with me every step of the way, and I'm grateful that I do get to see them grow up and get married and one day see some grandbabies. Every single time that I've had an opportunity to talk to a girl that might be going through the same thing or speak in, domestic violence events or police academy events or doing this, I am keeping a promise to God because I refuse to let this evil person and this bad thing remain a bad thing. I actively, proactively, positively will turn what he meant for evil into good. And I will do that until the day I die.
Nobody remembered seeing the killer arrive. That was a detail detectives repeated for years afterward, long after the blood dried, long after the headlines faded, long after terrified residents stopped sleeping with lights on through the night. In every interview, every police report, every exhausted late-night conversation between homicide investigators surrounded by coffee cups and crime scene photos, the same questions surface again, and again like a ghost clawing upward from darkness. How does someone enter a quiet suburban neighborhood, commit unimaginable violence, disappear into night, and leave behind almost nothing except fear? The answer would remain buried for more than 30 years beneath ordinary life, hidden behind lawn mowers, backyard fences, neighborhood smiles, and polite conversations between people who never imagined evil was standing directly beside them. Because the monster they hunted did not look like a monster. He looked like the man next door. The kind of man people trusted. The kind of man children waved to while riding bicycles down quiet streets glowing beneath soft evening sunlight. And that was precisely why nobody saw him coming. The murder scene looked almost theatrical in its brutality. Detectives arriving at the small suburban home shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning initially believed they were responding to a burglary gone wrong. Patrol officers had already sealed the property beneath flashing red and blue lights, while frightened neighbors gathered barefoot across the street, wrapped in blankets against the freezing rain. But inside the house, the atmosphere changed immediately. Veteran investigators sensed it before they even reached the second floor. This was personal, violent, controlled. Furniture had been overturned with extraordinary force. Picture frames shattered across hallway floors. Blood streaked along the bedroom wall in thin, desperate lines where the victim appeared to reach for stability before collapsing. The woman's body lay partially beside the bed, one arm extended outward toward the doorway, as though she had tried crawling away from something too terrifying to escape. 42 years old, elementary school teacher, divorced, lived alone except for a golden retriever now trembling silently inside the downstairs laundry room after the attack. Detectives quickly noticed another disturbing detail. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house. Doors locked, windows intact, alarm system disabled manually using the correct code. Someone either knew how to enter the home or had been inside before. The victim's name was Laura Bennett, and by sunrise her face dominated every local television broadcast across the state. Smiling school portrait, friendly eyes, warm laugh described repeatedly by co-workers struggling through emotional interviews outside the elementary school, where grief counselors now waited beside crying children too young to understand why their teacher would never return. Reporters flooded the neighborhood before noon. Helicopters circled overhead, while police canvassed nearby streets, searching desperately for witnesses. Yet almost nobody reported hearing anything unusual. No screams, no gunshots, no suspicious vehicles speeding away after midnight. Just rain, wind, silence. One elderly neighbor claimed she briefly noticed a flashlight moving behind Laura's backyard around 1:30 a.m., but assumed it belonged to police or utility workers. Another resident remembered seeing a middle-aged man walking calmly along the sidewalk earlier that evening, wearing gloves despite relatively warm weather. The witness described him as forgettable. Average height, average build, gray jacket, baseball cap. The kind of person your eyes slide past automatically in public without remembering 5 seconds later. Investigators wrote the statement down anyway. At the time, nobody realized how important that description would become. The autopsy only deepened the horror. Laura Bennett fought fiercely before dying. Defensive wounds covered her hands and forearms. Bruising suggested prolonged restraint. But forensic teams discovered something even more unsettling buried beneath the violence. Tiny fibers recovered from the victim's clothing did not match anything inside the house. Dark synthetic material consistent with industrial carpeting or vehicle upholstery. Detectives immediately theorized the killer may have transported equipment inside a van or truck. Then came another discovery. A partial fingerprint recovered from the upstairs bathroom mirror. Clear enough for identification. Investigators rushed the print through state databases, expecting quick results. Nothing. No criminal history. No military records. No law enforcement match. It was as if the killer had never existed officially before entering Laura Bennett's home that night. Days turned into weeks, while fear spread through surrounding suburbs like wildfire. Hardware stores sold out deadbolts and security lights. Gun sales increased dramatically across multiple counties. Women refused jogging alone after sunset. Parents checked bedroom windows repeatedly before sleeping. Every strange sound became suspicious. Every unknown car creeping through neighborhoods after dark triggered panic calls to police. Yet despite hundreds of interviews and thousands of tips, investigators remained trapped inside darkness. Then the phone call started. The first arrived 6 days after the murder. A woman living 12 miles from Laura Bennett's neighborhood contacted police claiming someone had called her repeatedly after midnight, breathing heavily into the receiver without speaking. Detectives initially dismissed a report as unrelated harassment until the woman mentioned one detail that froze the room completely silent. Before hanging up, the caller whispered softly, "Pretty house." 3 days later, another woman reported similar calls. Then another. All lived alone. All within driving distance of the original crime scene. Panic intensified instantly once local media discovered the connection. News stations warned viewers about a possible predator stalking suburban neighborhoods, searching for victims systematically. The phrase "cold-blooded phantom" appeared across front pages while investigators worked around the clock beneath growing political pressure demanding arrests. Then another body appeared. This time the victim was discovered nearly 60 miles away inside another quiet residential neighborhood, almost identical to first. Same late-night attack. Same absence of forced entry. Same terrifying level of control violence. Detectives arriving at the scene reportedly stared at each other before speaking, because the similarities felt impossible to ignore. The second victim, 36-year-old nurse Patricia Holloway, had also recently divorced, also lived alone temporarily, also owned security system manually disabled during the attack. But one detail transformed the investigation entirely. Witnesses reported seeing a man sitting inside a parked vehicle near Patricia's home multiple nights before the murder. Older white male, baseball cap, gray jacket, watching the neighborhood silently through the windshield before disappearing each morning before sunrise. The task force formed within 48 hours. Detectives from multiple jurisdictions gathered inside a temporary command center, surrounded by maps, photographs, and evidence boards stretching wall to wall beneath fluorescent lights humming through sleepless nights. Behavioral analysts believed the killer demonstrated extraordinary patience and organization. He stalked victims carefully before attacks, studied routines, learned alarm codes somehow, entered homes confidently without hesitation. Investigators theorized he possessed construction experience, security knowledge, or possibly even law enforcement training. The precision bothered everyone. This was not chaotic violence. It was methodical, almost rehearsed. Months passed, then years. The killer vanished. No more murders, no more phone calls, nothing. The case slowly transformed into legend inside law enforcement circles. Young detectives studied the files during training academies. Retired investigators revisited evidence obsessively long after leaving active duty, unable to accept defeat. Communities tried moving on, but fear lingered quietly beneath ordinary life. Families remembered locking windows earlier than before. Women still glanced over shoulders while walking toward parked cars after dark. Somewhere inside suburban memory, the phantom remained alive. Then, almost 30 years later, everything changed because of one impossible mistake. A retired homicide detective named Marcus Vale never stopped working the case privately after leaving the department. While others surrendered to time, Vale spent decades studying old evidence boxes stored beneath layers of dust inside county archives. He believed something vital had been overlooked during the original investigation. Advances in DNA technology reignited his obsession. Biological samples once considered useless now carried potential unimaginable during the early years of the murders. So Vale convinced authorities to re-examine preserved evidence using modern forensic genealogy. The results stunned everyone. Within months, analysts identified distant family connections buried inside public ancestry databases. Detectives slowly constructed an enormous family tree stretching backward across generations, searching for one man connected geographically to both murders during the correct years. Thousands of names narrowed into hundreds. Hundreds narrowed into dozens. Then finally one name surfaced repeatedly beside every critical location tied to the case. Daniel Hargrove, 68 years old, retired contractor, decorated community volunteer, respected neighbor, lived quietly less than 20 minutes from Laura Bennett's original murder scene. And for more than 30 years, nobody suspected him at all. The neighborhood refused to believe it at first. Even after detectives quietly placed Daniel Hargrove under surveillance, even after forensic analysts confirmed the DNA connection with terrifying certainty, even after investigators reopened decades of forgotten evidence and discovered his name buried repeatedly beside critical locations tied to murders, the people living around him continued describing the same man. Friendly, helpful, quiet. The retired contractor who repaired storm-damaged fences for elderly couples without charging money. The neighbor who waved every morning while collecting newspapers from the driveway beneath soft suburban sunlight. The volunteer who attended church breakfasts and community fundraisers, wearing pressed flannel shirts and calm smiles. Nobody imagined those same hands once tightened around terrified victims inside dark bedrooms, while entire neighborhoods slept unaware evil had already crossed the front lawn. That contradiction became the most horrifying part of the investigation. The monster did not hide outside society. He hid perfectly inside it. Detectives moved carefully after identifying Hargrove through forensic genealogy because one mistake could destroy the case completely. By then, he was 68 years old, living alone inside a modest suburban home surrounded by trimmed hedges and flower beds maintained with military precision. Surveillance teams monitored him for weeks before approaching. Every movement felt surreal. Officers watched him buy groceries, pump gas, drink coffee alone at local diners, while reading newspapers describing the cold case investigation that had secretly circled closer to him for months. Sometimes he smiled politely at strangers holding doors open for him. Sometimes he spent hours gardening quietly in the backyard. Ordinary routines, ordinary gestures. Yet every detective involved understood something chilling. Beneath that harmless exterior lived a predator investigators believed committed multiple murders and escaped justice for over 3 decades. The break came through garbage. One rainy Tuesday morning, investigators retrieved discarded trash bags left outside Hargrove's property before sanitation workers arrived. Inside, forensic teams recovered a used coffee cup and several cigarette butts. DNA extracted from both items returned the same result hours later. Perfect match. Not partial. Not probable. Absolute. The room reportedly fell silent after confirmation appeared across laboratory screens. Veteran detectives stared motionless at the paperwork, understanding the magnitude of what they were seeing. The ghost haunting the investigation for 30 years was no longer a theory. He was real. He had an address. And he had spent decades living peacefully while victims were buried and families destroyed. The arrest happened before sunrise. Residents woke to flashing red and blue lights flooding the quiet street, while tactical officers surrounded the house from every direction. Helicopters circled overhead. Reporters raced toward the neighborhood after emergency scanners exploded with activity across local media networks. Neighbors stepped outside wearing robes and slippers, staring in disbelief as armed officers escorted Daniel Hargrove down the driveway in handcuffs. Witnesses later described him looking strangely calm. No shouting, no resistance, just silence. One woman watching from across the street reportedly began crying uncontrollably after recognizing him. She kept repeating the same sentence again and again beneath trembling breath. Not Daniel. Not him. Impossible. Inside the house, investigators uncovered details far more disturbing than anyone expected. Hidden beneath ordinary suburban life were fragments of darkness preserved across decades like trophies buried inside memory. Detectives discovered newspaper clippings about the murders carefully organized inside storage boxes. Hand-drawn neighborhood maps marked with circles and notes matching old crime scene locations. Women's jewelry traced back to unsolved burglaries connected to the task force years earlier. Then forensic technicians opened a locked basement cabinet and found something that reportedly changed the atmosphere inside the entire house instantly. Photographs. Hundreds of them. Grainy surveillance-style images showing women entering homes, grocery stores, parking lots. Some victims investigators recognized immediately from the original case files. Others had never been identified publicly before. The realization hit detectives with overwhelming force. The murders everyone knew about may have represented only a fraction of Hargrove's hidden life. News coverage exploded nationwide within hours of the arrest. Headlines described a monster hiding in plain sight. Television anchors replayed footage of stunned neighbors, while criminal profilers flooded broadcasts discussing psychopathy, organized predators, and the terrifying ability some offenders possess to blend seamlessly into ordinary communities. Former classmates and co-workers appeared before cameras, struggling desperately to reconcile memory with reality. One man recalled fishing trips with Hargrove during the late 1990s. Another described him coaching youth baseball games. A retired neighbor remembered trusting him with house keys while traveling out of state. Every interview deepened public horror because each ordinary detail made the truth feel even more impossible. But investigators were only beginning to understand the scale of what they uncovered. As detectives re-examined old cold case files using modern forensic databases, patterns emerged stretching far beyond the original murders. Unsolved assaults, break-ins, suspicious disappearances, women reporting late-night stalking incidents near neighborhoods where Hargrove once lived or worked. The timeline expanded slowly across decades like a hidden trail buried beneath suburban history. One detective described the experience as digging through layers of camouflage. Everywhere they looked, pieces of Hargrove's life overlapped mysteriously with violence investigators once believed unrelated. Then came the witness statements. A woman from Nevada contacted authorities after seeing Hargrove's face on television. Her voice reportedly shook during the call. 31 years earlier, she survived a home invasion attack matching the exact behavioral patterns connected to the original murders. The attacker wore gloves, disabled the alarm system, entered without forced entry. She escaped alive only because neighbors heard crashing noises and called police before the assault escalated further. At the time, detectives never identified the suspect. But the moment she saw Daniel Hargrove's photograph broadcast across national news, She recognized the eyes immediately. More calls followed. California, Oregon, Washington, Arizona. Women who spent decades trying to forget suddenly confronted terrifying memories, reopened by one face appearing across television screens. Investigators realized the predator's hunting ground may have stretched across multiple states for years without detection because jurisdictions failed sharing information effectively during earlier decades. Before modern databases and digital evidence systems, predators moved through investigative gaps almost invisibly. Hargrove understood that weakness perfectly. The deeper detectives dug into his history, the darker the picture became. Employment records showed constant relocation patterns, coinciding disturbingly with clusters of unsolved violent crimes. Former girlfriends described controlling behavior and sudden mood swings. Co-workers recalled explosive anger, erupting unexpectedly over minor frustrations. One woman remembered waking during the night years earlier and finding Hargrove sitting silently beside her bed, staring into darkness without explanation. She ended the relationship days later, describing him afterward as a man wearing someone else's skin. Then came the interrogation. Detectives spent hours questioning Hargrove inside a sterile interview room beneath harsh fluorescent lights, while cameras recorded every movement. At first, he denied everything calmly. Soft voice, relaxed posture, cooperative demeanor. But investigators noticed subtle changes whenever photographs from the crime scenes appeared across the table. His breathing slowed. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. One detective later described the moment the performance finally cracked. Investigators presented forensic evidence connecting fibers recovered from Laura Bennett's clothing directly to carpeting removed from Hargrove's old work van decades earlier. Silence filled the room for nearly 20 seconds. Then Hargrove leaned backward slowly and smiled. Not nervous, not frightened, amused. The detective conducting the interview later admitted that smile haunted him more than any crime scene photograph he had ever witnessed, because in that moment, the harmless neighbor vanished completely, and something far colder finally looked back from behind the mask. The smile changed everything. For 30 years, investigators imagined the predator as a ghost moving silently through suburban darkness, a faceless intruder slipping across backyards while entire neighborhoods slept unaware death was already standing outside bedroom doors. Detectives built psychological profiles. Witnesses described shadows. Victims remembered breathing whispers, footsteps echoing through hallways after midnight. But inside that interrogation room beneath humming fluorescent lights, the myth suddenly became human. Daniel Hargrove leaned backward in his chair, folded his hands calmly across his lap, and smiled at the detectives confronting him with decades of buried evidence. Not panic, not fear, satisfaction, as if he had waited years for someone to finally catch up. One investigator later admitted the expression disturbed him more deeply than the murders themselves because it revealed something terrifying. Hargrove never viewed himself as cornered. He viewed himself as superior. The interrogation continued through the night. Detectives pressed him carefully, revealing pieces of evidence one fragment at a time. DNA recovered beneath fingernails, carpet fibers from the van, geographic overlap connecting him to unsolved attacks stretching across multiple states. At first, Hargrove answered politely in short, controlled sentences, denying involvement while maintaining unnerving eye contact with investigators. But every time detectives mentioned specific details from the original crime scenes, subtle reactions surfaced involuntarily. Tiny smiles, shallow breaths, a flicker of excitement across otherwise emotionless eyes. Behavioral analysts monitoring from another room noticed a pattern immediately. The crime still stimulated him emotionally decades later. Then investigators placed an old photograph on the table. Laura Bennett, smiling school portrait. Second grade teacher, dead for 31 years. Witnesses later said the atmosphere inside the room shifted instantly. Hargrove stared silently at the image for several seconds without speaking. Then he tilted his head slightly and asked one question in a calm, almost conversational tone. Did the dog survive? The detective conducting the interview reportedly felt cold move through his entire body. Because investigators never publicly released information about the golden retriever, discovered locked downstairs during the original murder investigation. Only the killer knew the animal survived. And suddenly, after 3 decades of theories and speculation, the nightmare sitting across the table became undeniable. The confession did not come all at once. It emerged slowly, fragment by fragment, like something rotting beneath floorboards finally breaking through the surface. Hargrove never cried, never apologized, never displayed visible remorse. Instead, he spoke about the murders with chilling emotional detachment, describing neighborhoods' routines, alarm systems, and victim behavior the same way another man might discuss construction projects or weather patterns. Detectives realized quickly that he remembered everything: dates, street layouts, entry points, even details buried inside evidence files forgotten by most investigators years earlier. The passage of time had weakened his body, but not his memory. According to transcripts later released publicly, Hargrove described stalking neighborhoods for weeks before attacks. He parked near parks, grocery stores, elementary schools. He watched lights inside homes, observed routines, learned which husbands traveled frequently for work, which women lived alone, which houses left curtains partially open after dark. Sometimes he entered homes during daytime hours while residents worked, disabling alarm systems quietly so he could return later without resistance. The level of preparation horrified detectives because it transformed the murders from acts of sudden violence into calculated operations unfolding over long periods of surveillance. Then came the most disturbing revelation yet. The killings were never the primary thrill. Fear was. Hargrove admitted he enjoyed watching communities collapse psychologically after each murder. He followed news coverage obsessively, collected newspaper clippings, recorded television broadcasts discussing the investigation. Sometimes he drove slowly through frightened neighborhoods after attacks just to observe police patrols and terrified residents installing security lights. He described the atmosphere almost nostalgically during questioning. The panic, the uncertainty, the feeling that nobody knew where he would strike next. One detective later stated the interrogation revealed something profoundly chilling about organized predators. For men like Hargrove, violence alone is not enough. They crave control over entire communities. As details leaked publicly, national outrage exploded. Reporters camped outside the courthouse 24 hours a day. Victims' families flooded television interviews demanding answers. Former neighbors who once defended Hargrove now avoided cameras entirely after investigators uncovered the basement photographs and stolen trophies linked to unsolved crimes. The suburban street where he lived transformed into a media circus filled with satellite trucks, protesters, and detectives carrying evidence boxes beneath flashing camera lights. Yet amid the chaos, another horrifying question emerged. How many victims remained unidentified? Task force investigators reopened cold cases stretching back nearly 40 years. Women previously dismissed during earlier investigations suddenly found their stories taken seriously again. One described waking during the night in 1989 and discovering a masked intruder standing beside her bed before he disappeared through a back window, without explanation. Another remembered finding personal items missing after unexplained break-ins police once categorized as minor burglaries. Everywhere detectives looked, fragments of Hargrove's hidden life surfaced quietly from forgotten records. The pattern became impossible to ignore. He escalated gradually across decades, first prowling, then stalking, then home invasions, then murder. Psychologists later studying the case described Hargrove as a compartmentalized predator, a man capable of separating monstrous violence from ordinary social behavior with terrifying efficiency. He coached baseball games while secretly following women through parking lots. He attended church dinners after nights spent watching victims through windows. He repaired neighbors' fences while preserving souvenirs from violent crimes hidden inside locked basement cabinets beneath his own house. That duality fascinated criminal profilers nationwide because it exposed one of the most frightening truths about predatory offenders. Some do not isolate themselves from society. Some integrate perfectly into it. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued searching Hargrove property room by room, behind basement walls, Investigators discovered hidden storage compartments containing decades-old photographs, jewelry, handwritten notes, and maps connecting directly to unsolved assaults investigators never publicly associated with the case before. Then technicians uncovered something even more disturbing hidden inside a sealed toolbox beneath construction equipment. Cassette tapes. Dozens of them, labeled only by dates. Forensic audio specialists later confirmed the recordings contained hours of surveillance observations spoken in Hargrove's voice. Women's schedules, vehicle descriptions, neighborhood layouts, window locations, dog activity. Some tapes captured him whispering observation from parked vehicles while stalking potential victims late at night. Others contained recordings of local television news coverage discussing murders investigators now believed he committed himself. Listening to the tapes reportedly disturbed even veteran homicide detectives accustomed to violent crime scenes, because for the first time, they heard the predator thinking aloud in real time. Calm, patient, methodical. One recording captured Hargrove softly laughing while describing a neighborhood panic meeting held after one of the murders. Another included detailed comments about police patrol routes and response times. The realization hit investigators with overwhelming force. For years, the killer sat invisibly among terrified communities, watching fear spread exactly as he intended. Then came another revelation. A retired patrol officer contacted the task force after recognizing Hargrove's face during televised coverage. 33 years earlier, the officer stopped a suspicious vehicle parked near one of the future murder scenes during a routine nighttime patrol. The driver identified himself calmly as a local contractor unable to sleep, simply taking a drive through the neighborhood. No warrants, no criminal record, nothing suspicious enough for arrest. The officer let him go. The name on the old report? Daniel Hargrove. The discovery devastated investigators emotionally because it confirmed something unbearable. The predator came dangerously close to capture years earlier and slipped away unnoticed into darkness. As prosecutors prepared formal charges, public fascination with the case deepened into obsession. Podcasts dissected every detail. Criminal profilers analyzed interrogation footage frame by frame. Former acquaintances sold interviews describing ordinary interactions now transformed into chilling memories after the truth emerged. But beneath the headlines and courtroom drama, victims' families faced a more painful reality. Justice arriving after 30 years still cannot return stolen lives. Laura Bennett's parents died before learning who murdered their daughter. Patricia Holloway's son grew into adulthood, carrying unanswered grief through every stage of life. Survivors spent decades sleeping beside fear, while the man responsible attended neighborhood cookouts pretending to be harmless. And somewhere inside that contradiction lived the true horror of Daniel Hargrove. Not simply that he killed, but that he smiled politely afterward while the world searched desperately everywhere except the right house. The tapes became the heart of the nightmare. Not the murders, not the photographs, not even the DNA evidence that finally exposed Daniel Hargrove after 30 years hidden behind ordinary suburban life. It was the sound of his voice. Calm, controlled, patient. Investigators spent weeks listening to hours of recordings recovered from the locked basement toolbox beneath his house. At first, the tapes sounded almost mundane. Street names, weather observations, vehicle descriptions spoken softly into a handheld recorder during late-night surveillance drives through sleeping neighborhoods. But the longer detectives listened, the darker the recordings became. Hargrove was not simply watching victims. He was studying them, timing routines, measuring vulnerabilities, learning private details strangers should never know. One tape captured him whispering observations about a woman who left her kitchen light on past midnight every Thursday while grading papers at the dining room table. Another described a divorced nurse who jogged alone before sunrise, wearing headphones loud enough to block surrounding sounds. The precision disturbed investigators deeply because it revealed something terrifying. The murders were only the final stage of a much longer process, unfolding invisibly around victims for weeks beforehand. Then detectives discovered the lists. Folded pages hidden between old utility bills inside basement storage boxes. Names, addresses, handwritten schedules. Some women investigators recognized immediately from existing case files. Others had never reported suspicious activity at all. Many were still alive. The realization struck like ice water. Hargrove had potentially stalked dozens, perhaps hundreds, of women across multiple states without ever attacking them physically. He watched, waited, chose carefully. Sometimes he moved on. Sometimes he escalated. Nobody understood completely why certain women survived, while others became headlines dominating local news broadcasts for years. Behavioral analysts reviewing the evidence noticed another disturbing pattern. Control excited him more than violence itself. The break-ins, the surveillance, the hidden phone calls, the manipulation of fear spreading through entire communities after attacks. It all fed the same psychological hunger. Hargrove wanted power over ordinary life. He wanted women afraid inside their own homes. He wanted neighborhoods suspicious of every shadow after dark. He wanted investigators exhausted, confused, chasing ghosts while he stood invisibly beside them, blending into suburban normality. And for 3 decades, he succeeded. The case exploded internationally after leaked interrogation transcripts reached media outlets. Television networks interrupted programming to discuss the growing list of potential victims linked to Hargrove's movements over 40 years. Criminal profilers compared him to some of the most organized serial predators in modern history. Reporters camped outside the courthouse through rainstorms waiting for glimpses of the former contractor, now accused of unimaginable crimes. Yet amid the national attention, investigators quietly confronted another horrifying possibility. The known murders might represent only a fraction of reality. Cold case units across 5 states reopened unsolved homicides, stretching back to the late 1970s. Detectives searched for similarities previously overlooked before modern forensic databases existed. Women living alone, nighttime attacks, no forced entry, signs of prolonged stalking before the crimes. Everywhere authorities looked, fragment of Hargrove's past seemed to intersect mysteriously with violence. Then came the Oregon file. A retired detective contacted the task force carrying boxes of evidence from a murder committed 34 years earlier in a coastal town nearly 400 miles away from Laura Bennett's case. The victim, 28-year-old waitress Emily Voss, had been found inside her apartment after neighbors reported hearing strange noises shortly after midnight. The original investigation collapsed quickly due to lack of physical evidence and limited forensic technology available at the time. But one detail buried deep inside old reports immediately caught modern investigators' attention. Witnesses described a middle-aged man repeatedly visiting the diner where Emily worked during weeks leading up to the murder. Quiet, polite, always sitting alone, always watching. Detectives compared an old witness sketch against recent photographs of Daniel Hargrove. The resemblance was undeniable. Forensic teams rushed preserved evidence from the Oregon crime scene into modern DNA analysis laboratories. Detectives waited anxiously while technicians processed samples untouched for decades. Then confirmation arrived. Another match, another victim, another family destroyed while the killer returned home afterward to continue ordinary life uninterrupted. The announcement devastated communities already struggling to process the original charges. Suddenly, the monster hidden beneath suburban normality appeared far larger than anyone imagined. Reporters revisited old neighborhoods connected to Hargrove's work history, searching desperately for additional leads. Women contacted police departments nationwide describing encounters they buried emotionally years earlier after convincing themselves the experiences meant nothing. One woman remembered waking during the 1980s to discover muddy footprints across her kitchen floor despite locked doors and windows. Nothing stolen. No visible intruder. Another recalled finding personal photographs moved slightly inside bedroom drawers after returning from work. A third described receiving silent phone calls for nearly 6 months before eventually moving out of state entirely because fear consumed her life. Each story alone sounded small. Together they painted something monstrous. A predator moving quietly through ordinary American life for decades while victims doubted their own instincts. Then investigators uncovered the hidden attic space. Construction teams assisting forensic searches noticed unusual measurements between interior walls and roof dimensions inside Hargrove's garage. Behind stacked shelves and insulation, detectives discovered a concealed compartment inaccessible without removing heavy wooden panels manually. Inside sat several sealed plastic containers untouched by moisture or time. Detectives opening them reportedly stood speechless for several moments afterward. More trophies, driver's licenses, jewelry, women's clothing, newspaper clipping from murders never publicly connected to Hargrove before. And beneath everything else, videotapes, dozens. The FBI immediately seized the collection, fearing the recordings might contain evidence of assaults or unidentified victims. Specialists spent weeks reviewing footage inside secure facilities. Some tapes showed surveillance recordings filmed secretly from parked vehicles outside homes. Others captured local news broadcasts discussing unsolved murders, while investigators unknowingly searched for the man recording them. Then analysts discovered footage apparently filmed inside victims' homes before attacks occurred. Windows, bedrooms, hallways, quiet domestic spaces observed silently through hidden cameras or nighttime intrusions. The recordings transformed public fear into outrage. People no longer saw Hargrove simply as a murderer. He became the embodiment of hidden predation itself. The stranger watching quietly from darkness, while ordinary families lived unaware they were already being studied. And still, Daniel Hargrove remained eerily calm throughout the investigation. Court appearances revealed the same unsettling composure detectives first witnessed during interrogation. He rarely spoke publicly, rarely reacted emotionally. Survivors entering courtrooms hoping to see fear or remorse instead encountered a gray-haired old man sitting motionless beneath fluorescent lights, while prosecutors described decades of violence in graphic detail. That emotional emptiness infuriated victims' families. Laura Bennett's younger sister delivered one of the most devastating courtroom statements during preliminary hearings. Fighting tears, she described watching her parents die without ever learning who murdered their daughter. She spoke about birthdays spent beside empty chairs, about trauma spreading across generations like poison long after headlines disappeared. Then she turned directly toward Hargrove and asked one question investigators themselves carried silently for decades. How many women did you watch before deciding who deserved to die? For the first time since his arrest, witnesses noticed visible movement from Hargrove. A slight smile, barely noticeable, but enough to send a wave of visible horror through the courtroom gallery. Because in that tiny expression, survivors suddenly understood something unbearable. The predator still enjoyed the fear. Even now, even exposed, even cornered after 30 years hidden behind fences and friendly neighborhood conversations. And somewhere beneath the endless evidence, beneath the courtroom lights and national headlines, investigators began confronting a possibility more terrifying than all the others combined. If DNA technology had not advanced when it did, Daniel Hargrove might have died peacefully as a respected old neighbor, without anyone ever discovering what lived behind the mask. The attic tapes changed the investigation from a murder case into something far darker. Until that moment, detectives believed they were hunting the truth behind several brutal cold case killings buried beneath decades of silence. But once FBI analysts completed reviewing the videotapes recovered from Daniel Hargrove's hidden compartment, the scale of the nightmare expanded beyond anything investigators publicly imagined. The recordings revealed years of stalking behavior so methodical, so calculated, that seasoned federal profilers reportedly stopped referring to Hargrove as a serial killer alone. They began describing him as a long-term psychological predator, a man addicted not simply to violence, but to ownership, control, fear. The tapes showed neighborhoods through rain-covered windshields at 2 a.m, women unloading groceries, unaware someone watched from shadows nearby, children playing in front yards while a hidden camera zoomed slowly toward houses in the background, entire lives observed silently without consent. Sometimes Hargrove whispered notes into the recorder while filming, calm observations spoken with horrifying patience. Second floor window unlocked tonight. Husband traveling again Thursday. Dog reacts slowly after midnight. Listening to the recordings felt less like reviewing evidence, and more like entering the private mind of a monster who viewed suburban life as hunting territory. One particular tape disturbed investigators more than all the others combined. It lasted nearly 4 hours. No confrontation, just surveillance. The camera remained hidden inside a parked vehicle facing a small yellow house in northern Oregon while soft rain tapped against the windshield. Inside the house, an ordinary family moved through routine evening life, completely unaware someone was watching from darkness nearby. A mother helping children finish homework. A husband asleep on the couch. Kitchen lights switching off room by room as midnight approached. Then Hargrove whispered something investigators later repeated during closed-door FBI briefings because of how deeply unsettling it sounded. They think walls protect them. That sentence transformed the entire psychological profile of the offender because it revealed the real source of gratification, not murder itself. Power over safety. Hargrove enjoyed destroying the illusion that ordinary life could shield people from violence. Locked doors, alarm systems, quiet neighborhoods. None of it mattered once he selected a target. That realization echoed through communities nationwide after details from the tapes leaked publicly. Families who once viewed suburbs as safe suddenly reconsidered everything. Security companies reported massive spikes in alarm installations. Gun sales increased again. Social media flooded with terrified discussions about hidden predators living unnoticed among ordinary neighborhoods. And still investigators continued uncovering more victims. Cold case units from California, Washington, Nevada, and Arizona submitted preserved forensic evidence for DNA comparison against Hargrove's profile. Some matches arrived quickly. Others took months. But the pattern became undeniable. Wherever Hargrove relocated for construction work during the 1980s and 1990s, unsolved assaults and disappearances seemed to follow quietly behind him like shadows. Then came a Nevada case. A 24-year-old woman vanished after leaving work at a roadside diner in 1987. Her vehicle was discovered abandoned 3 days later beside an empty highway rest stop. No body ever recovered. No witnesses. The investigation collapsed almost immediately due to lack of evidence. For decades, her family lived suspended between hope and grief, never fully knowing whether she escaped somewhere voluntarily or died alone beneath desert darkness. But detectives reviewing Hargrove's employment history discovered he worked construction less than 15 miles from the diner during the exact month she disappeared. Then forensic technicians identified fibers inside the abandoned vehicle matching synthetic carpet material recovered from Hargrove's old work van. Another family destroyed. Another ghost rising from forgotten evidence. The media storm intensified brutally after the Nevada connection became public. News networks began referring to Hargrove as the neighbor phantom. True crime podcasts released daily episodes analyzing his movements year by year. Former classmates, co-workers, ex-girlfriends, even casual acquaintances suddenly found themselves questioned by reporters desperate to understand how one man concealed decades of predatory violence behind ordinary suburban existence. Most gave similar answers. He seemed normal. That word haunted investigators repeatedly throughout the case. Normal. He smiled normally, worked normally, paid taxes normally, attended church normally. Neighbors described him shoveling snow from elderly driveways during winter storms. One woman recalled him helping search for a lost family dog years earlier. Another remembered trusting him with house keys during vacations because he seemed dependable and calm. Nobody recognized the darkness because Hargrove understood performance better than suspicion. That became one of the FBI's most important conclusions later released publicly. Organized predators often survive not because they appear frightening, but because they appear reassuring. Hargrove studied social behavior carefully. He understood how much friendliness to display, how much privacy to maintain, when to speak, when to disappear quietly. He blended into suburban environments the same way camouflage disappears into forest shadows. Then investigators uncovered another disturbing behavioral pattern hidden inside the tapes. Souvenirs. Not merely jewelry or photographs stolen from victims after attacks, but tiny, deeply personal objects carrying emotional significance invisible to outsiders. Birthday cards, hairbrushes, family snapshots, restaurant receipts, children's drawings. The items themselves appeared worthless financially, Yet profilers immediately recognized their psychological importance. Hargrove wanted permanent possession over fragments of victims' lives long after crimes ended. Every stolen object extended the feeling of control privately for years afterward. One recovered box contained dozens of handwritten notes about victims investigators still could not identify fully. Descriptions of routines, clothing, habits, emotional reactions during surveillance. Reading them reportedly disturbed detectives profoundly because the entries sounded intimate, almost obsessive, despite victims never knowing Hargrove existed. She sings while cooking, cries after phone calls sometimes, checks locks twice before bed now. That final note chilled investigators, especially because it confirmed something terrifying. Hargrove watched fear developing inside victims after stalking incidents without revealing himself directly. He enjoyed observing paranoia grow slowly within ordinary life. Then came the breakthrough nobody expected. A retired journalist reviewing old newspaper archives contacted the task force after recognizing similarities between Hargrove and an unidentified man photographed accidentally in the background of a crime scene image from 1984. Detectives retrieved the original negatives immediately. Modern enhancement technology clarified the blurry figure standing behind police tape near one of the unsolved murders. Daniel Hargrove, watching the investigation into his own crime. The image exploded nationally once released publicly. Americans stared in disbelief at the photograph, showing the future suspect standing casually among crowds while detectives worked the scene only yards away. Hands inside jacket pockets. Expression unreadable. Invisible. That single image came to symbolize the entire horror of the case. The predator hiding in plain sight, while communities searched desperately for monsters somewhere else. Meanwhile, survivors linked to older assaults began stepping forward publicly for the first time in decades. One woman described waking in 1991 to discover a masked intruder standing silently beside her bed before fleeing through a sliding glass door moments later. Another remembered receiving anonymous phone calls describing details from inside her house no stranger should know. Many victims admitted they never contacted police originally because no physical attack occurred. They convinced themselves they were overreacting. Now they understood differently. The monster had been real all along, and for years, he moved quietly through American suburbs, collecting fear the same way other men collect trophies. Then, during one late-night evidence review, investigators discovered a final detail buried inside Hargrove's handwritten notes that changed the emotional direction of the entire case. Besides several victims' names, he wrote the same sentence repeatedly, almost ready, not chosen randomly, prepared, conditioned slowly through stalking, intrusion, fear, and surveillance until violence became inevitable. Detectives later admitted that realization haunted them more deeply than the murders themselves because it suggested something unbearable. Long before victims ever saw Daniel Hargrove, he already knew them intimately. The phrase, "almost ready," spread to the task force like poison. Detectives stared at the handwritten words for hours beneath harsh fluorescent lights, while evidence photographs covered conference room walls around them. 3 decades of murder investigations suddenly looked different. The attacks were not impulsive explosions of violence. They were cultivated slowly, carefully, almost scientifically. Daniel Hargrove studied fear the way predators study prey in the wild. He watched women long before they understood they were being watched. He entered homes secretly without attacking immediately. He moved objects slightly, opened windows, left tiny traces invisible to everyone except the victims themselves. Then he waited for paranoia to grow, waited for routines to fracture, waited for fear to isolate them emotionally before violence finally arrived. One FBI profiler later described Hargrove's methods as psychological erosion. He did not simply invade homes. He invaded reality itself until victims doubted their instincts, their memory, even their sanity. And suddenly, hundreds of forgotten reports across multiple states began making terrifying sense. Women claiming objects moved mysteriously overnight. Anonymous breathing during late-night phone calls. Unlocked doors somehow found open in the morning. Footsteps outside bedroom windows after midnight. For years, many police departments dismissed the incidents individually because no direct violence occurred. Some victims even convinced themselves stress or imagination explained what happened. But now investigators recognize a pattern buried beneath decades of scattered fear. Hargrove rehearsed inside people's lives before attacking them. The realization horrified the public once leaked to media outlets. News broadcasts replayed survivor interviews continuously, while criminal psychologists explained how organized predators psychologically condition victims through repeated boundary violations. Communities nationwide reacted instantly. Families installed cameras. Women purchased additional locks. Social media flooded with stories from people suddenly re-examining strange experiences buried deep in memory. The case no longer felt distant. It felt possible everywhere. Then investigators uncovered the entry kits. Hidden inside old toolboxes recovered from Hargrove's garage were carefully organized burglary tools wrapped in cloth to prevent noise. Lock-picking sets, window wedges, electrical tape, flashlights modified with dim red filters, handwritten notes documenting alarm system brands and bypass techniques. The level of preparation stunned forensic experts because it resembled tactical planning more than ordinary criminal behavior. But one item disturbed detectives more than all the others combined: a collection of house keys. Hundreds of them, each labeled only by dates and abbreviations investigators still struggled identifying completely. Some matched homes connected to known victims. Others corresponded addresses where women reported unexplained intrusions years earlier, without signs of forced entry, which meant something horrifying. Sometimes Daniel Hargrove did not break into houses at all. Sometimes he simply walked through the front door. The discovery transformed public perception of the case entirely. The predator no longer seemed like a shadow appearing briefly during isolated attacks. He became something worse. A long-term presence quietly moving through suburban communities for decades, collecting access to ordinary lives one house at a time. Then another witness came forward. A former locksmith from Sacramento contacted federal investigators after recognizing Hargrove during televised coverage. The elderly man remembered him clearly because of unusual behavior during the late 1980s. Hargrove regularly requested duplicate house keys, while claiming he needed them for construction projects or emergency maintenance jobs. At the time, nothing seemed suspicious. Contractors copied keys constantly. But after the arrest, one memory returned with unbearable clarity. Hargrove always paid cash and never wanted receipts. Investigators immediately reopened burglary reports connected to neighborhoods where Hargrove worked during those years. The results were devastating. Women describing signs of intrusions without theft, bedroom drawers disturbed slightly, personal photographs moved, curtains repositioned, tiny details easy to dismiss individually but terrifying when viewed together. The predator had likely entered dozens of homes undetected for years, possibly hundreds. Then came the audio tape labeled July 14th. FBI analysts reviewing recovered evidence discovered the cassette hidden separately from the others inside a sealed evidence bag beneath insulation in the attic compartment. Unlike previous recordings filled with surveillance observations, this tape captured something entirely different: a conversation. At first, investigators heard only muffled voices and background static. Then a terrified woman began pleading softly for someone to leave her house. Detectives listening reportedly froze instantly because the emotional fear in her voice felt painfully real even decades later. Hargrove remained calm throughout the recording, speaking gently while moving through the house. He told the woman he only wanted to look around. He instructed her repeatedly not to scream. Then the tape ended abruptly after the sound of a door closing. No victim associated with the recording existed in known case files. No police report matched the incident. Nothing. The woman remained unidentified. That realization shook investigators deeply because it suggested an even darker possibility buried beneath the case. How many women survived encounters with Hargrove without ever reporting them? How many terrifying nights vanished silently into private memory because victims feared disbelief or humiliation? The task force established a special hotline afterward asking potential survivors to contact authorities confidentially. Calls flooded in immediately. Thousands. Some clearly unrelated. Others disturbingly credible. Women described incidents stretching across 4 decades involving mass intruders, stalking behavior, strange phone calls, and unexplained home entries matching Hargrove's methods precisely. One survivor from Arizona described waking during the early 1990s and finding muddy boot prints beside her bed despite locked doors and intact windows. Another remembered hearing a man breathing softly outside her bedroom for nearly an hour before police arrived and found nothing. Several women recalled discovering personal objects missing after suspicious break-ins where nothing valuable was stolen. Every story added another layer to the nightmare, because fear itself became evidence. Then prosecutors made another announcement that sent shockwaves nationwide. DNA linked Hargrove directly to 4 additional murders previously considered unrelated cold cases. For more women, for more grieving families, for more suburban communities forced to relive horrors buried beneath decades of silence. The timeline now stretched across nearly 20 years of violence, and investigators still believe the true number remained incomplete. Meanwhile, Daniel Hargrove continued sitting silently through hearings as prosecutors described the expanding scale of his crimes. Reporters watching courtroom footage noticed something unsettling repeatedly. Whenever victims' family members cried during testimony, Hargrove watched them carefully with visible concentration, not sympathy, interest, almost curiosity. The same emotional detachment investigators heard inside the surveillance tapes still existed beneath the aging suburban mask. That realization fueled growing public anger, demanding harsher punishment. Protesters gathered outside courthouses carrying photographs of victims, while survivors appeared on television describing decades of trauma and paranoia. One woman admitted she slept beside loaded firearms for 20 years after surviving a stalking incident investigators now linked to Hargrove's movements. "He stole normal life from us," she said during an interview that spread nationally. Even when he wasn't there anymore, fear stayed. Those words haunted the investigation because they captured something larger than murder statistics or courtroom evidence. Daniel Hargrove did not simply kill people. He infected communities. Fear spread outward from every intrusion, every rumor, every unsolved attack. Entire neighborhoods changed behavior because of him. Women altered routines. Families installed alarms. Parents warned children about strangers long after headlines faded. And through all of it, the predator lived quietly among them, pretending to be harmless. Then, late one evening during evidence review, detectives discovered perhaps the most chilling item recovered from Hargrove's hidden attic compartment. A map, large, folded repeatedly from years of handling. Across multiple states, hundreds of tiny red circles marked neighborhoods connected to surveillance notes, break-ins, assaults, and murders. But scattered between the circles were dozens of locations investigators had never seen before. Unknown targets. Unknown victims. Unknown stories buried somewhere beneath ordinary suburban streets across America. And suddenly the task force confronted a terrifying possibility. Even after 30 years, they still might not know the full truth about Daniel Hargrove. The map terrified investigators more than the murders, not because of what it confirmed, because of what it suggested. Hundreds of red circles spread across multiple states like infection points on a disease chart. Neighborhoods, apartment complexes, small suburban streets, quiet communities where ordinary families once believed nothing truly evil could happen. Some locations matched known victims already connected to Daniel Hargrove through DNA evidence and recovered surveillance notes. Others corresponded to suspicious incidents buried deep inside forgotten police reports. But dozens of circles remained completely unexplained. No homicide records, no assaults, no surviving witnesses investigators could immediately identify. Just locations marked carefully by a predator who spent decades studying human vulnerability, the way hunters study migration patterns in wilderness. The task force began referring to the unidentified locations as silent zones, places where something may have happened, or almost happened. That uncertainty became unbearable, because somewhere buried beneath ordinary American life were potentially dozens of people who encountered Daniel Hargrove without ever understanding how close they came to becoming part of his hidden history. Federal investigators launched one of the largest cold case reviews in modern criminal history. Detectives cross-referenced property records, unsolved missing person files, stalking complaints, burglary reports, and emergency calls spanning nearly 40 years. Entire rooms filled with archive paperwork reopened for the first time in decades. Dust-covered evidence boxes emerged from storage shelves untouched since the 1980s. Retired detectives returned voluntarily to assist younger investigators overwhelmed by the scale of the case. And everywhere they looked, Hargrove appeared, a suspicious vehicle outside a neighborhood days before an unsolved disappearance. A contractor performing repairs near an assault scene. A polite middle-aged man drinking coffee alone inside diners close to victims' workplaces. Invisible patterns hidden in plain sight for years. Then detectives uncovered the Idaho file. The case involved 29-year-old Rebecca Sloan, a bookstore employee who vanished after leaving work during the winter of 1988. Her car was discovered abandoned beside a highway 30 miles outside town, with the driver's door partially open and groceries still inside. No signs of struggle. No body. No suspect. The disappearance slowly faded from national attention after investigators exhausted leads without success. Until now, a red circle on Hargrove's map matched the exact rural area where Rebecca's car had been found. Detectives reopened preserved evidence immediately. Weather damage and outdated forensic collection methods complicated analysis, but investigators discovered something horrifying buried inside old witness interviews. A gas station employee reported seeing a gray-haired man speaking calmly with Rebecca shortly before she disappeared. The description sounded generic at the time. Average height, baseball cap, friendly demeanor, forgettable. Now it sounded familiar, too familiar. Then came another breakthrough. FBI forensic analysts enhanced audio recovered from damaged cassette tapes found inside Hargrove's attic compartment. One recording captured him describing the bookstore girl weeks before Rebecca vanished. He discussed her routines, her vehicle, her closing shifts at work. At one point, investigators heard him whisper softly, "She notices people too easily, must move slowly." The recording reportedly left seasoned detectives physically shaken because it proved something critical. Rebecca Sloan had been hunted long before she disappeared. And suddenly her cold case no longer looked random at all. Public fear intensified again after the Idaho connection reached national news broadcasts. Americans watched stunned as investigators revealed the possible scope of Hargrove's movements across decades. Survivors flooded hotlines. Former neighbors contacted police describing strange encounters they once dismissed as coincidence. Some people admitted they could no longer sleep comfortably after learning how carefully the predator blended into normal suburban environments. One woman from Oregon broke down during a televised interview while describing a conversation she shared with Hargrove at a community barbecue years earlier. He spent nearly an hour discussing home security systems casually while helping neighbors cook hamburgers beside laughing children. At the time, the interaction seemed harmless. Now she remembered something differently. He asked detailed questions about whether her husband traveled often for work. The realization nearly destroyed her emotionally because suddenly ordinary memories transformed into reconnaissance. Investigators, meanwhile, focus intensely on reconstructing Hargrove's psychological evolution over time. Behavioral experts concluded the predator became increasingly confident after repeatedly avoiding capture throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Early surveillance notes showed caution and hesitation. Later recordings revealed arrogance, mockery, even amusement toward law enforcement efforts. One tape captured Hargrove parked near an active crime scene listening to police radio chatter through a handheld scanner while quietly laughing to himself. Another included detailed criticism of investigative mistakes made during earlier murder cases. "He's standing too close to the tire tracks," Hargrove whispered about one detective at a scene. "They already ruined the prints." The tape spread internally through law enforcement agencies and devastated morale among retired investigators connected to the original cases. Many realized the killer observed police operations directly while remaining completely unsuspected nearby. He was not merely escaping detection. He was studying it, Then prosecutors announced another disturbing discovery recovered from Hargrove's hidden files. Insurance records. Dozens of them. Not his own. Victims. The predator secretly collected personal information far beyond names and addresses. He tracked employment histories, medical appointments, travel schedules, even financial struggles. Detectives concluded he deliberately selected emotionally vulnerable women whenever possible. Divorced, isolated, living alone temporarily. Women under visible stress who might dismiss early signs of stalking as anxiety rather than genuine danger. That strategy explained why so many survivors initially doubted themselves after suspicious incidents occurred. Hargrove counted on disbelief, counted on normal life burying fear beneath routine obligations until it became too late. And for decades, he was right. Then the courtroom testimony began. Survivors entered one by one beneath flashing cameras and crowded media attention, while Daniel Hargrove sat motionless only feet away. Some women cried openly while describing years of trauma and paranoia. Others spoke with cold, controlled anger sharpened by decades of unanswered fear. One survivor from Washington described waking during a thunderstorm in 1992 and hearing footsteps moving slowly through her hallway. She assumed initially that her teenage son returned home late from a party, but moments later a flashlight beam appeared beneath her bedroom door. She locked herself inside a bathroom and called police while someone quietly walked to the house for nearly 20 minutes before disappearing. No suspect was ever identified. Until now, investigators later matched the attack date precisely to Hargrove's work schedule in the area. The survivor stared directly at him during testimony and asked a question that silenced the courtroom completely. "How long were you watching me before that night?" Hargrove never answered. He simply lowered his eyes briefly toward the defense table. But for the first time since the investigation exploded publicly, witnesses noticed something new beneath the predator's calm exterior. Irritation. The control was slipping. The carefully maintained suburban mass that survived 30 years unnoticed was finally cracking beneath overwhelming evidence and survivor testimony. Yet even as prosecutors built one of the strongest serial murder cases in modern history, investigators remain haunted by another possibility hidden beneath the growing mountain of evidence. What if the unknown red circles on the map represented victims nobody would ever identify? What if entire stories vanished permanently into darkness because time erased witnesses, evidence, and memory itself? Late one evening, Detective Marcus Vale sat alone, reviewing the map again beneath dim office lights after most of the task force returned home. He traced his fingers slowly across the red circles scattered through decades of violence and fear. Then he noticed something strange. One location had never been investigated at all. A remote wooded area outside Northern California. No corresponding police file. No victim. No explanation. Just a single red circle marked heavily in black ink beside two handwritten words. Buried here. Buried here. 2 words, written in black ink beside a red circle hidden among hundreds of markings across Daniel Hargrove's map. Detective Marcus Vale stared at the handwriting for several seconds beneath dim office lighting, while rain hammered softly against the task force windows outside. Everyone else had gone home hours earlier. Coffee cups sat abandoned across evidence tables. Photographs of victims covered nearby walls like silent witnesses, watching from decades of unresolved grief. Yet in that moment, none of it mattered except those 2 words. Buried here. Not maybe. Not possible. A statement. Precise. Confident. Vale immediately contacted federal investigators, and within hours a search team assembled before sunrise near the remote Northern California location marked on Hargrove's map. The area sat miles beyond the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest and abandoned logging roads swallowed slowly by nature over decades. Fog rolled through the trees as investigators pushed deeper into wilderness, carrying ground-penetrating radar equipment and excavation tools beneath cold gray skies. Nobody spoke much during the drive. Every detective understood the terrible possibility waiting beneath the soil if Hargrove buried victims there. The case was about to become even worse. The search lasted nearly 9 hours before technicians discovered the first anomaly underground. A shallow rectangular disturbance beneath layers of roots and compacted dirt, human-sized. Silence spread instantly across the forest clearing as excavation teams began digging carefully by hand. Detectives watched from behind yellow tape, while cameras documented every movement. Then one investigator uncovered fabric fragments buried beneath the soil. Moments later came bone. Human remains. The atmosphere reportedly changed immediately. Even veteran homicide detectives accustomed to violent crime scenes struggled emotionally as forensic anthropologists continued uncovering skeletal remains from the gravesite. Then another body appeared beside the first. And another. 3 victims, buried together. For decades, the discovery exploded internationally before sunset. News helicopters circled above the excavation zone, while reporters interrupted broadcasts nationwide, describing the horrifying expansion of the Hargrove investigation. Americans watched live coverage showing forensic tents rising between trees, while law enforcement officials refused confirming how many additional graves might exist nearby. Fear surged again because a predator once viewed as a suburban killer now appeared something far darker, a collector of hidden graves. The FBI immediately expanded searches across multiple remote locations connected to red circles on Hargrove's map. Cadaver dogs swept wooded areas, abandoned farmland, and isolated desert locations spanning several states. Within weeks, investigators uncovered additional burial sites tied directly to Hargrove's movements during the 1980s and early 1990s. The body count climbed steadily. 5, 7, 10. Each discovery reopened old nightmares for families who spent decades trapped between grief and uncertainty. One of the recovered victims was eventually identified as Rebecca Sloan, the missing bookstore employee whose disappearance haunted Idaho investigators since 1988. Her younger brother reportedly collapsed during the official identification briefing after learning his family's unanswered questions finally had a horrifying conclusion. For 34 years, they imagined possibilities endlessly. Maybe she ran away. Maybe she survived somewhere under another identity. Maybe she would walk to the door unexpectedly one day. Instead, she spent decades buried beneath forest soil while her killer attended neighborhood cookouts pretending to be harmless. That truth shattered people emotionally across the country. Then forensic investigators made another chilling discovery at the California burial site. Personal belongings intentionally preserved beside several victims. Jewelry, hair clips, photographs sealed inside plastic wrapping, and handwritten notes. Hargrove documented burial dates the same way someone records maintenance logs or work schedules. Short observations appear beside victim descriptions written in calm, precise handwriting. Quiet now. No more panic. Finally stopped running. The notes horrified forensic psychologists reviewing the evidence because they reveal complete emotional detachment from human suffering. Victims were not people to Hargrove. They were possessions, completed projects, controlled outcomes preserved privately long after media attention disappeared. And still the discoveries continued. At another burial site in rural Nevada, investigators uncovered remains linked to a woman missing since 1983 after leaving a casino night shift. Her mother died years earlier, without learning what happened to her daughter. Detectives assigned to the identification later admitted the emotional weight became almost unbearable because so many families never survived long enough to receive answers. Justice arrived too late. Again and again. Meanwhile, courtroom proceedings transformed into national spectacle. Prosecutors unveiled evidence piece by piece while survivors and victims' relatives packed public galleries beneath crushing media attention. Every hearing revealed new horrors. Every witness testimony deepened the scale of the nightmare. Then prosecutors introduced the burial map into evidence. The courtroom reportedly fell silent the moment jurors saw it displayed across large digital screens. Hundreds of red circles scattered across the western United States, like blood stains spreading through time. Some marked murders. Some marked stalking sites. Some corresponded to unidentified locations investigators still had not fully searched. And somewhere among them remained unknown stories buried beneath decades of silence. The prosecution called FBI profiler Dr. Elaine Mercer to explain Hargrove's behavioral evolution to the jury. Her testimony became one of the most haunting moments of the trial. He learned confidence through survival, she explained calmly. Every year he escaped detection reinforced a belief that he was untouchable. He didn't merely hide from society. He studied it, manipulated it, adapted inside it. Then she said something that visibly unsettled the courtroom. Predators like Daniel Hargrove are terrifying because they understand trust better than most ordinary people do. That sentence spread across national headlines within hours because it explained the impossible contradiction haunting the case from the beginning. The killer succeeded for decades not by appearing dangerous, but by appearing safe. Then came testimony from survivors who unknowingly crossed paths with death itself. A retired schoolteacher described inviting Hargrove into her home during the early 1990s after he offered to help repair storm damage to her garage roof. At one point, he wandered briefly upstairs alone while she prepared coffee in the kitchen. Weeks later, she began experiencing strange disturbances inside the house. Missing items, open windows, anonymous late-night phone calls. She moved away eventually after paranoia consumed her life. Now investigators believe Hargrove likely copied her house key during that first visit. Another woman recalled waking during childhood and seeing a man standing outside her bedroom window, watching silently from darkness before disappearing between houses. Decades later, she recognized Daniel Hargrove immediately after his arrest photograph appeared online. Each testimony added another layer of horror because it revealed how many lives brushed unknowingly against hidden violence. Yet perhaps the most devastating moment of the trial arrived unexpectedly during forensic testimony involving one of the burial sites. Investigators recovered a tiny silver bracelet buried beside Rebecca Sloan's remains. The bracelet contained an engraving from her younger sister reading, "Come home safe." The courtroom broke emotionally after prosecutors displayed the bracelet before jurors. Rebecca's surviving family members wept openly while reporters rushed outside broadcasting updates nationwide. And through all of it, Daniel Hargrove remained silent. No apology, no visible remorse, no explanation, just the same cold expression witnesses described during earlier hearings, until prosecutors revealed one final piece of evidence recovered from the hidden attic compartment, a sealed envelope, addressed simply, "To whoever finds us first." Inside sat a handwritten confession spanning nearly 40 pages. And according to investigators who reviewed it privately before trial, the contents were worse than anyone imagined. The confession letter felt less like a statement and more like a weapon. 40 handwritten pages sealed inside an envelope hidden beneath attic insulation for decades. Detectives who opened it initially believed they were about to uncover final answers surrounding the murders, the burial sites, the unidentified victims still haunting cold case databases across multiple states. Instead, they found something far more disturbing. Daniel Hargrove was not confessing out of guilt. He was controlling the story one last time. The pages contained no apology, no remorse, no emotional reflection about destroyed families or stolen lives. Instead, the letter read like a private conversation between the predator and the investigators who spent decades chasing him. Calm observations, corrections aimed at earlier police theories, detailed descriptions of surveillance techniques, and home entries written with almost professional pride. At several points, Hargrove openly mocked law enforcement failures that allowed him to escape capture repeatedly throughout the 1980s and 1990s. "You look for monsters," one line read, "but monsters don't survive long. Ordinary men do." That sentence spread through media coverage within hours after portions of the letter leaked publicly. And suddenly the entire country understood something deeply unsettling. The killer believed normality itself was his greatest disguise. Prosecutors debated privately whether portions of confession should even be introduced during trial because of how psychologically manipulative the writing appeared. Behavioral experts warned the letter represented another extension of Hargrove's need for control. Even exposed, even imprisoned, even facing life sentences and possible death penalty proceedings, he still wanted power over investigators, victims' families, and public fear itself. Yet buried inside the pages were revelations too important to ignore. The first major shock involved victim selection. For years, profilers believed Hargrove targeted women fitting specific physical or emotional patterns. Divorced, isolated, living alone temporarily, vulnerable. But the confession suggested something far more random and terrifying. Sometimes victims were chosen simply because they noticed him. A glance in a parking lot, a brief conversation at a gas station, a woman locking eyes with him too long while walking home. Hargrove interpreted ordinary human awareness as challenge or invitation. Once someone entered his attention psychologically, obsession often followed. Investigators reviewing confession realized many victims likely never understood the moment their lives changed forever. Then came the passage that reportedly sickened even veteran FBI profilers. Hargrove described entering homes repeatedly before attacks without stealing anything or waking residents. He moved objects deliberately to create uncertainty later. Kitchen chairs slightly repositioned. Family photographs turned at subtle angles. Windows cracked open just enough for victims to question memory rather than suspect intrusion. I wanted them afraid of themselves first, he wrote. The sentence devastated survivors reading courtroom transcripts afterward because it perfectly explained the long psychological torment so many experienced before violence escalated. Hargrove weaponized doubt. Victims questioned their sanity while he watched fear slowly consume ordinary routines. But the darkest section of the confession involved children, not direct violence. Observation. Hargrove admitted he sometimes studied entire family for months while waiting for opportunities to isolate adult victims. During those surveillance periods, he watched children play in yards, ride bicycles, walk home from school. One passage described him sitting inside parked vehicles for hours while neighborhoods carried on normal daily life around him. The children always trusted the street, he wrote. Adults teach them danger comes from strangers. That was a mistake. The statement triggered national outrage immediately after prosecutors referenced it during trial proceedings. Parents across the country reacted viscerally because the sentence shattered one of society's most comforting assumptions. Evil announces itself clearly. Predators look dangerous. Threats arrive from outside familiar life. Daniel Hargrove proved the opposite. Danger sometimes waves politely from across the driveway. Then investigators uncovered another horrifying detail buried deep inside the confession. There were more burial sites. Not many, but enough. Specific coordinates hidden within cryptic references to mountains, rivers, abandoned highways, and logging roads across the western United States. FBI search teams mobilized immediately, while prosecutors kept details sealed from public release temporarily to prevent media chaos. Over the following weeks, authorities uncovered additional remains connected to disappearances spanning nearly 20 years. Some victims were finally identified. Others remained unknown. Jane does buried beneath wilderness while decades passed overhead unnoticed. The discoveries emotionally destroyed many investigators involved in the case. Detectives who spent careers solving violent crimes later admitted the Hargrove investigation haunted them differently because of the scale of hidden suffering buried beneath ordinary suburban history. One FBI evidence specialist reportedly resigned 6 months after reviewing the attic tapes and confession materials, telling colleagues privately, "It feels like he was everywhere." That feeling spread nationally. The predator no longer resembled one isolated killer from a distant crime documentary. He became symbolic of invisible danger woven quietly through modern life itself. Then came the testimony from Daniel Hargrove's former wife. Until that moment, she avoided public attention almost entirely, living under intense media scrutiny after the arrest shattered her world publicly. Neighbors described her afterward as emotionally destroyed, unable to reconcile decades of marriage with the monster investigators uncovered hidden beneath ordinary domestic life. When she finally entered the courtroom, reporters described absolute silence spreading through the gallery instantly. She testified for nearly 4 hours. At first, her statements focused on normal memories, family vacations, backyard barbecues, holidays, mortgage payments, arguments about bills and household repairs, completely ordinary suburban marriage. Then prosecutors asked whether she ever suspected violent behavior. Her answer chilled the courtroom. "No," she whispered. "That's what terrifies me." She described waking occasionally during the night and discovering Hargrove missing from bed for hours without explanation. Sometimes he claimed insomnia. Sometimes late-night drives helped him relax. Once she found muddy boots hidden inside the garage sink before sunrise and assumed he had been fixing equipment outside. Now she understood differently. The realization visibly broke her emotionally during testimony, because while she slept peacefully believing she knew the man beside her, women were dying. Then prosecutors introduced one final recording recovered from the attic compartment. Unlike previous surveillance tapes, this recording appeared made shortly before Hargrove's arrest. His voice sounded older, slower, but still calm, still controlled. In the tape, Hargrove reflected quietly on aging, memory, and the possibility of eventually being caught through advancing forensic technology. At one point, he laughed softly while discussing DNA genealogy databases becoming more sophisticated over time. "It only takes one mistake now," he said. Then came the final sentence. And according to courtroom observers, it produced one of the most horrifying silences of the entire trial. "I stopped because the world changed, not because I wanted to." The implication hit instantly. The predator never evolved morally, never regretted the violence, never found conscience. He simply understood technology eventually made hunting too dangerous. Fear swept through the courtroom because the statement revealed something unbearable. If forensic science had not advanced, if DNA genealogy had not exploded years later, Daniel Hargrove may never have stopped at all. As the recording ended, survivors cried openly across courtroom benches, while jurors sat visibly shaken beneath fluorescent lights. Reporters rushed outside broadcasting updates nationwide. Social media erupted instantly. Millions of people listening to the tape reached the same chilling conclusion simultaneously. The killer next door was never truly gone. He only ran out of places to hide. The courtroom no longer felt like a trial. It felt like an excavation site. Every witness testimony unearthed another layer of horror buried beneath decades of ordinary suburban life. Every piece of evidence stripped away another illusion people once trusted about safety, neighbors, routine, and the comforting belief that monsters reveal themselves clearly before it's too late. By the time prosecutors reached the final weeks of proceedings against Daniel Hargrove, the nation had become obsessed not only with the crimes, but with the terrifying psychology behind them. How does someone live among families for 40 years while secretly carrying an entire graveyard inside his memory? That question haunted every headline, every interview, every late-night conversation between frightened strangers watching coverage unfold across television screens. And still, Daniel Hargrove remained almost unnervingly calm. Court artists sketched him sitting motionless beneath fluorescent lights, while survivors described shattered lives only feet away. Some days he took notes quietly during testimony. Other days he stared toward the prosecution without visible reaction at all. But investigators watching closely began noticing subtle changes as the evidence mounted relentlessly. Tiny cracks forming beneath the mask, a tightening jaw, fingers tapping briefly during burial site testimony. Irritation whenever prosecutors discussed DNA genealogy technology publicly. The control was disappearing. And for men like Hargrove, control was everything. Then the prosecution unveiled the final forensic reconstruction timeline. Large digital screens illuminated the courtroom as investigators mapped Daniel Hargrove's movements across 4 decades. Construction jobs, vehicle registrations, surveillance notes recovered from attic compartments, DNA evidence, witness sightings, missing person reports. One by one, the red markers spread across Western America like spreading infection. California, Oregon, Nevada, Idaho, Arizona, Washington. The pattern horrified jurors immediately. This was not chaos. It was infrastructure, a hidden system of predation operating silently beneath normal American life for decades. FBI analysts explained how Hargrove adapted continuously to avoid detection. In earlier years, he targeted neighborhoods with limited police coordination between counties. Later, he shifted states frequently, exploiting poor communication between agencies before digital databases became standardized nationally. When media attention intensified after specific murders, he paused temporarily and focused instead on stalking behavior without violence. He evolved strategically every time law enforcement techniques improved. He treated fear like a long-term project, One federal profiler testified. That sentence stayed with jurors long after proceedings ended each day because it captured the scale of emotional destruction left behind by the case. Daniel Hargrove did not merely murder victims. He engineered paranoia across generations. Then prosecutors introduced evidence recovered from Hargrove's final storage unit rented secretly under a false identity only months before his arrest. Investigators initially believed the unit contained construction equipment or financial records. Instead, they discovered another hidden archive. Boxes, hundreds of them, organized carefully by year. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, maps, police scanner frequencies, victim schedules, and journals documenting decades of surveillance activity in astonishing detail. Some entries stretched back nearly 40 years. Others appeared disturbingly recent. One journal entry dated only 3 years before his arrest described a woman jogging alone beside a suburban bike trail. "Too many cameras now," Hargrove wrote. Different world. The sentence chilled investigators because it reinforced the terrifying conclusion prosecutors already suspected. The predator had not stopped psychologically. Modern surveillance technology simply made physical attacks harder to conceal. Then came perhaps the most devastating testimony of the entire trial. A woman named Karen Mitchell entered the courtroom quietly beneath intense media attention. Few people recognized her name initially because, unlike many victims connected to Hargrove, Karen survived physically unharmed, at least outwardly. 32 years earlier, Karen reported suspicious stalking incidents to local police after repeatedly noticing the same man parked near her apartment complex late at night. She described anonymous phone calls, moved furniture, missing personal items, and unexplained signs someone entered her home while she slept. Officers found no evidence of forced entry and eventually suggested stress or anxiety might explain the disturbances. Karen spent years believing them, until Daniel Hargrove's arrest photograph appeared on national television. The moment she identified him publicly, investigators searched preserved evidence from her old apartment case and found DNA matching Hargrove on window frames previously ignored during the original investigation. Karen sat before the jury trembling visibly while describing the emotional collapse that followed those experiences. "I stopped trusting my own mind," she whispered. The courtroom remained silent. "I thought I was becoming insane." That statement struck the emotional core of the entire case more powerfully than even the burial site evidence, because suddenly jurors understood the true scale of damage left behind by predators like Hargrove. Some victims survived physically, but psychologically. He buried parts of them alive. Then Karen revealed one final detail investigators never released publicly before trial. During one of the anonymous phone calls decades earlier, the stalker whispered softly before hanging up, "You'll understand soon." Those exact words later appeared inside Hargrove's handwritten journals recovered from the storage unit. The connection shattered any remaining defense arguments suggesting mistaken identity or coincidence. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, public fear evolved into something darker: suspicion. Americans across the country began reevaluating ordinary memories through a new lens. The friendly neighbor who watched too carefully. The contractor asking strange personal questions. The unknown car parked repeatedly near school zones or apartment complexes late at night. Hotline reports flooded federal agencies as thousands of people revisited unsettling encounters once dismissed harmlessly. Behavioral psychologists later described the cultural impact of the Hargrove case as profound because it attacked one of society's deepest assumptions, that evil feels distant. Instead, the investigation revealed how violence can exist silently beside ordinary life for decades while nobody notices. Then prosecutors delivered the final blow. Digital forensic analysts recovered deleted files from old hard drives hidden inside Hargrove's garage workshop. Technicians spent months rebuilding damaged data fragments before finally uncovering encrypted journals containing his private reflections about victims and investigations over time. One passage stood out immediately. "I was never hiding," Hargrove wrote. "People only see what makes them comfortable." That sentence echoed through media coverage nationwide because it explained everything terrifying about the case in a single thought. Neighbors trusted familiarity more than instinct. Communities trusted appearances more than patterns. Investigators trusted old profiling assumptions more than uncomfortable possibilities. And Daniel Hargrove survived inside those blind spots for 40 years. As closing arguments approached, survivors and victims' relatives packed the courtroom daily, hoping finally to witness accountability after decades of unanswered grief. Some carried photographs of loved ones. Others clutched journals documenting years of fear and trauma. Many simply stared toward Hargrove, exhausted disbelief, still struggling to comprehend how one ordinary-looking man concealed such monstrous violence behind fences, handshakes, and suburban routine. Then came the prosecution's final statement. The lead prosecutor stood before jurors beneath absolute silence and spoke slowly while images of victims appeared across courtroom screens behind him. Daniel Hargrove built his life on a single belief, he said, that ordinary appearance protects predators better than darkness ever could. Then he pointed directly toward the defendant, and for decades, he was right. The courtroom remained silent for several seconds afterward. No movement, no whispers, only the weight of 30 years, settling finally into one unbearable truth. The monster was never hiding in abandoned alleys or distant shadows. He was mowing the lawn next door, while families slept believing they were safe. The verdict arrived beneath absolute silence. No reporters moving. No whispers from the packed courtroom gallery. No sound except the quiet rustle of paper as jurors returned their seats after 2 days of deliberation, carrying the weight of 40 years of fear, death, and unanswered grief. Survivors sat gripping photographs in trembling hands. Victims' relatives stared forward without blinking, emotionally exhausted after months reliving nightmares many spent decades trying desperately to bury. Television cameras waited outside courthouse doors, broadcasting live coverage to millions across the country. And at the center of it all sat Daniel Hargrove, still calm, still controlled, still wearing the same expression investigators first encountered during interrogation, when DNA finally shattered the mask hiding one of America's most terrifying predators. The foreperson stood slowly. Guilty. The word landed like impact shock through the courtroom. Guilty on murder. Guilty on kidnapping. Guilty on unlawful imprisonment. Guilty on multiple counts connected to stalking, home invasion, and concealment of human remains spanning decades. One charge after another. The list seemed endless. Some family members cried openly. Others sat motionless in stunned silence, emotionally numb after waiting 30 years for justice many once believed impossible. Reporters later described the atmosphere as strangely conflicted. Relief existed, certainly. But relief alone could not erase the horrifying reality exposed during trial. The monster had lived among ordinary people for most of his life without consequence. And somewhere deep beneath that realization lingered a national unease impossible to shake completely, because if Daniel Hargrove remained invisible for 40 years, who else still was? The sentencing phase began weeks later, and prosecutors wasted no time presenting the emotional devastation left behind by the crimes. Victim impact statements lasted days. Entire lifetimes compressed into courtroom testimony filled with grief, trauma, rage, and irreversible loss. Laura Bennett's niece spoke about growing up beside photographs of an aunt she never met. Rebecca Sloan's younger brother described how their mother died every year, emotionally each time another birthday passed without answers. Survivors detailed decades of insomnia, panic attacks, failed relationships, and psychological collapse caused by a predator who turned ordinary life into permanent uncertainty. One woman addressed Hargrove directly. "You stole safety from people who never even knew your name." The sentence echoed through media coverage nationwide because it captured the true legacy of the case more clearly than statistics ever could. Fear survived longer than the murders themselves. Then came Detective Marcus Vale. The investigator who discovered the buried here notation on Hargrove's map entered the courtroom quietly without dramatic introduction. Unlike prosecutors or FBI profilers, Vale spoke plainly, tired, honest. He described excavation sites hidden beneath forests and desert soil, evidence rooms overflowing with forgotten victims, finally identified after decades of silence. The emotional collapse of families receiving long-awaited answers too late for parents, spouses, and siblings who died before truth arrived. Then he paused briefly before saying something that visibly affected even hardened courtroom observers. The hardest part wasn't finding the bodies, he said. It was realizing how normal his life looked while all of this existed underneath it. That contradiction became the defining image of the entire case. A smiling neighbor above ground, a graveyard beneath. And perhaps that was why America became so obsessed with Daniel Hargrove long after the trial ended. Not because the crimes themselves were uniquely brutal compared to countless horrors buried inside criminal history, but because the case destroyed comforting illusions people depend on daily to feel safe. Evil should look evil. Predators should feel threatening. Danger should announce itself clearly before entering your home. Hargrove proved none of that was true. The sentencing decision arrived 3 months later. Multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. Additional federal charges pending. The judge spoke for nearly 40 minutes describing the crimes as calculated psychological terrorism carried out against entire communities. At one point he addressed Hargrove directly. "You spent decades convincing yourself you were invisible," the judge said. "But invisibility ends eventually. It always ends." For the first time since his arrest, witnesses noticed visible emotion cross Daniel Hargrove's face. Not remorse, not sorrow, anger. A sharp, controlled anger lasting only seconds before disappearing again behind the familiar mask. But it mattered because investigators finally saw the truth clearly in that moment. The predator never accepted guilt emotionally. He accepted defeat. And there is a difference. Then, as proceedings concluded and deputies prepared escorting him from the courtroom forever, something unexpected happened. Hargrove turned briefly toward the public gallery, toward survivors, toward grieving families, toward the people whose lives he shattered across 4 decades. And he smiled. Not broadly, just enough. A tiny expression almost identical to the one detectives described during the first interrogation after DNA exposed him publicly. That smile haunted people afterward more deeply than courtroom photographs or forensic evidence ever could. Because even at the very end, beneath overwhelming proof and national hatred, Daniel Hargrove still carried the same terrified belief that protected him for decades. Control, the illusion that fear itself belonged to him. But outside the courthouse, the world had already changed. Cold case investigations nationwide accelerated dramatically after the Hargrove trial demonstrated the power of forensic genealogy technology. Police departments reopened forgotten files once considered impossible to solve. Families who spent decades without answers suddenly found renewed hope through modern DNA advancements. Across America, investigators quietly reviewed old evidence boxes gathering dust in storage rooms, wondering how many hidden predators remained undiscovered behind ordinary lives. The Hargrove case became more than a criminal investigation. It became a warning. Because for 30 years, communities searched for monsters in dark alleys, abandoned highways, and violent strangers lurking outside suburban neighborhoods. Meanwhile, the real predator attended barbecues, fixed fences, waved politely from the driveway, and waited patiently for darkness. Years later, journalists revisiting the story often returned to the same unsettling image. Daniel Hargrove mowing his lawn beneath bright afternoon sunlight, while buried evidence sat hidden inside attic compartments and basement walls only feet away. Children rode bicycles down the street. Neighbors walked dogs past the house casually. Ordinary life moved forward peacefully around a man carrying decades of violence silently beneath his skin. That image remained unforgettable because it forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth about evil itself. Sometimes horror does not arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives smiling. The victims, however, refuse disappearing into headlines permanently. Memorials now stand in several communities connected to the investigation. Names once trapped inside cold case files finally return to families, histories, and public memory. Laura Bennett, Rebecca Sloan, Emily Voss. Women reduced for decades to evidence numbers and forgotten newspaper clippings, now remembered as daughters, sisters, teachers, friends, human beings whose lives mattered long before violence stole them away. And still, even after convictions, excavations, confessions, and decades-late justice, one final truth continued haunting investigators privately long after cameras disappeared. Daniel Hargrove was caught because technology evolved faster than he did, not because the darkness inside him ever stopped. Somewhere tonight, another quiet neighborhood will fall asleep believing safety lives behind locked doors and familiar faces. Porch lights will flicker across peaceful streets. Families will drift into dreams assuming monsters belong only to television documentaries and distant headlines from another time. But the Hargrove case left behind a warning impossible to bury. Sometimes the most terrifying predators are not the strangers hiding outside the neighborhood. Sometimes they already live inside it,